The Dark Knight Rises had big shoes to fill after The Dark Knight. Maybe that's why the Nolan brothers waited 4 years before concluding their trilogy. But after Batman Begins was inspired by Batman Year One and The Dark Knight was supposedly inspired by its sequel, The Long Halloween, where did the Nolan brothers had to go from there? Which comics did they have to adapt? Should they have taken inspiration from Dark Victory to show Robin's early days? Nightfall to show Bane breaking Batman's back? No Man's Land to show the United States cutting ties with Gotham? Bruce Wayne Murderer to show Bruce in prison? War Games to show Batman revealing himself in broad daylight? Should they have showed the Lazarus Pit, which allows Ra's al Ghul to be immortal? Or The Dark Knight Returns to show an aging Batman resuming his quest after almost a decade of absence to take up arms against a nuclear threat? Welcome to Frank Movie Talks. I'm Frank, and today I'm going to explore The Dark Knight Rises. It seems that in order to conclude their trilogy, the Nolan brothers tried to adapt pretty much all of the Batman comics into one movie. And in all fairness, for a patchwork of so many different stories, I think it's still well executed. The only problem is that by compressing so much intrigue, you end up sacrificing a lot. The characters lose all their nuance and depth, they barely have time to grow through the story, and ultimately, even the action scenes do not do justice to the powerful works to which they are supposed to pay homage. So we end up with a pretty dull Robin, the scene where Batman gets his back broken is nowhere near as spectacular as in the comics, the adaptation of No Man's Land is a missed opportunity, as is the adaptation of Bruce Wayne Murderer and War Games, and Bruce doesn't look old enough for his return to be as exciting as it is in The Dark Knight Returns. That being said, the adaptation of the Lazarus Pit, which resuscitates people in the comics into an underground prison which offers a metaphorical resurrection to Bruce Wayne, is still elegant in the realistic context of Nolan's trilogy. But by combining so many classic Batman stories without really taking the time to do them justice, The Dark Knight Rises already announces the fiasco that will be Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice, which will try in a single film to catch up with all of what Marvel had built during 8 years by mixing The Dark Knight Returns, The Death of Superman, and Crisis on Infinite Earths in a movie which also tries to insert the origin of the Justice League in this bizarre mixture. Of course, let's save all of that for a future episode, but if I allow myself to compare both movies now, it's because when Zack Snyder was filming BVS, he at least had the excuse of racing against Marvel, who was 8 years ahead of him. But when the Nolans were filming The Dark Knight Rises, who were they racing against to justify such a rushed scenario? Well, the Nolans were racing against themselves, against the themes on which they had built their adaptation of Batman and which were already starting to get old just 4 years after the success of The Dark Knight. Indeed, the American troops got the better of Bin Laden in 2011, and in 2012, the time was no longer to the hunt of terrorists and images still evoking 9/11, which Snyder still won't understand 4 years later, but I really have to leave him alone until I finish this episode. As of 2012, what really started to itch, let's say 99% of people, is how they get treated by the remaining 1%, who control 99% of the resources and the wealth of the planet. This is a problem that was ironically at the heart of Batman movies and series during the 90s, a problem even older than the 90s, but that was not addressed at all in Nolan's trilogy. So they needed to finish their anti-terrorist trilogy as quickly as possible before the world changed too much around them, before the world looked more like the real Gotham from the comics, separated between extremely rich and extremely poor people. In order not to sound too out of touch with their times, the Nolan brothers decided to hide the punch that Bane actually has the same terrorist motivations as the antagonists of the first two films behind demands that resonated with the Occupy Wall Street movement, what Bolshevik calls making a Thanos, in honor of the villain by which Marvel writers wanted to address an issue like resource scarcity while avoiding any reflection on the subject, such as when the Avengers defeat Thanos without solving the problem that he was trying to solve.
Si vous tenez à proposer un méchant satisfaisant dans une Amérique secouée par Occupy Wall Street, sortez un Bane bien vénère avec une rhétorique rappelant celle des 99% contre les 1%, inégalité de richesse, contre le capitalisme financier, les élites corrompues et tout le tout-team. Mais c'est juste pour en planquer une autre complètement claquée au sol. T'as cru qu'on allait aborder une thématique ? Eh ben non, on te fait une Thanos.
You think all this can last? You're all gonna wonder how you ever thought you could live so large and leave so little for the rest of us.
C'est vrai, mais qu'est-ce que tu veux ? Détruire Gotham, c'est ça ? Allez, soyons raisonnables, allons sauver le statu quo.
As we can see, the character of Catwoman suffers from the same problem, as she spends the film giving the same speech as Bane, only to eventually throw all of her motivation out of the window at the end of the film and retire with Bruce Wayne.
I'll give myself up on one condition.
What's that?
We run away to Europe together, sip tea in a cafe, and live happily ever after.
Wholly unsatisfying ending.
As for Bruce, in order to put him on the right side of the conflict, the Nolan brothers make him lose all his money, and suddenly we learn that during the first two films, Bruce often visited orphanages. Which is very true to the character, but which the Nolan brothers had never seen fit to show us before the Wall Street protestators made it fashionable. While Batman Begins and The Dark Knight had barely finished introducing all the elements of Batman's mythology, The Dark Knight Rises suddenly declares that Bruce's crusade against crime is over. As if concluding the trilogy required to also conclude Batman himself, and as if an atomic explosion would end crime and corruption. The result, Bruce wears the Batman costume for just a few months before disappearing for 8 years, then puts it back on for a few days before disappearing forever. Did Batman at least have a Batcave during that time? No. Rebuilding the Batcave was the promise that Batman Begins ended with, and that its sequel failed to live up to. But The Dark Knight also ended with a promise its sequel failed to honor.
I think you and I are destined to do this forever.
I understand that the situation here is a little different, since the actor is dead. But the problem is not that Heath Ledger is dead. Even though the Joker doesn't appear in The Dark Knight Rises, you'd think he and Batman would continue to face each other beyond the third movie. But we can't, as Batman retires at the end. Not only does this significantly diminish Batman's mythical character, it also strips him of everything that makes him a tragic character. Just because Gotham made a statue doesn't make him mythical, and just because Alfred cries doesn't mean it's tragic. It's tragic when Alfred sees the child he promised to raise in happiness turning his back on happiness. It's tragic when Batman and Catwoman cannot spend the rest of their lives in a cafe waiting each day for Alfred to see them.
I would love to live with you in your castle. Forever, just like in a fairy tale.
Openly inspired by A Tale of Two Cities and Rocky 3, the storyline of The Dark Knight Rises is divided in two parts. In the first half, we see Bruce recovering from his leg injury to become Batman again. And in the second half, we see Bruce recovering from his back injury to become Batman again. Of course, the film has some qualities. After all, we're offered a much better version of Bane than what we saw in Batman and Robin. This concludes my retrospective of Christopher Nolan's trilogy. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you'll be there for the Snyder movies and their side effects. But before I get into this strange universe, I invite you to watch the next episode, which will be about the differences between Superman and Batman, and which will explain why it's important to respect these differences. To make sure you don't miss a thing, subscribe to the channel, like and share the video, it truly helps.